Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. We're back in the usual Monitor Steve setup to talk about the new AMD Radeon RX 6700 XT. I think this has been, as we've sort of been going on, a fairly successful series where we do all the benchmarking in one video and then we get on and have a chat about it. So how are you doing today, Steve?
Yeah, good. And I always find these discussions quite enjoyable. It's kind of live, but not live. So we just do it whenever we've got time, which is, I guess, why we don't do it live. But we have a few things in mind that we want to talk about, and we just work through it. I enjoy the discussions. I reckon they're cool, and it seems like a lot of the viewers are as well. So that's always a good thing.
Yeah, it's kind of like our discussions that we have when we're going through some of the reviews that we do. Obviously, that's all that stuff's under NDA because the videos tend to not have been published yet. But yeah, I think it's very similar to those. And I always think, this was such a great discussion. Wouldn't that be good to put on the YouTube channel? So yeah, I think this series sort of covers that. So hopefully at this point, you've watched the 6700 XT review, because we're not really going to be talking about like game benchmarks or those sorts of things because it's all in the review. So at this point, there's, I guess, a couple of lingering things we want to talk about. And one of the main ones we'll probably kick it off with is the actual retail pricing and availability of these products. Because obviously when you produce a review under NDA, you don't get that information. But now we have a much clearer picture of where the 6700 XT sits. And I guess from my perspective, looking at what AMD said about having more stock than their previous launches, I think that's probably turned out to be true. Would you say that that's an accurate representation?
Well, again, it's going off what I've heard from people in the industry, but it certainly sounds like retailers got more. Again, it's hard to gauge because they're all sold out. But from what I've been told, there was certainly more stock available upon release. And I knew that factually before the reviews went live. Retailers I spoke to said, yes, we've received significantly more of these than we have pretty much any other GPU for quite a few releases now. So that's obviously good. But that could just mean that AMD built up more of an inventory. So the initial wave was bigger than what we've seen previously. What's going to happen with, follow-up, resupply, restock down the track, a week from now, 2 weeks from now? Are they going to keep flowing in healthy numbers, or is it just going to be sort of like what we saw with the RTX 3060 Ti, where you were mentioning earlier, where that thing just seems to have disappeared? So a bit of a strange situation there.
Yeah.
So that all remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's like, in the market of the GPUs at the moment, there's kind of really two groups that you can separate your GPUs into. There's stuff that, obviously they're all low stock, but some of the stuff does get resupplied from time to time. So we've talked about this a couple of times previously. It's the fully unlocked dies, your 3090, 3070 and 3060, although 3060 is still a bit to be seen because it's still a new product. And then on the AMD side, it's been the 6900 XT, and everything else falls into the other bracket where there's just nothing's coming in. We haven't seen 3060 Ti's. We haven't seen 3080s. People still waiting for like launch day pre-orders of 3080s, and it's been 6 months now. So I guess it is positive that the 6700 XT is more likely to fall into that first bracket of it being not a cut down die. It's a new die that AMD is producing. Should mean that resupplies are going to be more readily available, especially if AMD dedicates more of their 7nm supply to it. But again, all that stuff is still up in the air. The one thing that has been made abundantly clear with this launch is the massive price disparity between the AMD reference model and the AIB GPUs. There are some models being sold from brands, especially like Asus, for example, where it's like double the price of the reference card. And there are some models that are sort of your more entry-level products, but all of those are still significantly price inflated versus the reference model. So I think that's a fairly interesting situation that we're seeing there, where maybe AMD has a bit more control over the reference model pricing, so they can say, hey, you have to sell this at $479. It's our product, so that's what it is. And then all the price inflation is happening on the AIB card. So yeah, it's been an interesting situation. I think you have a few numbers there from like PC Case Gear, for example, here in Australia.
Yeah. Well, yeah, first of all, you and I were quite shocked when we first ran into this with the 6800 XT and 6800 releases.
Yep.
We were expecting, what would you say, the usual premium for a decent quality AIB card, usually around 20%.
Yep.
So you get something like from MSI, for example, you get a Ventus model at or very, very near the MSRP. And then for 20% more, you get like a Gaming X type model, and then above that, it's the reserved for the Lightnings or the very premium models. So yeah, again, $480 US for those that need reminding, because, well, you'd be excused if you did, because if you think the price is $480 US and you start looking online, you'd be scratching your head, because, yeah, as Tim was saying, it's really only those reference models that we believe AMD's controlling, dictating the price on, are selling for $480 US. There was the ASRock Challenger D 2-fan card, not sure if it was dual slot, that was $480. Of course, they're all out of stock. And there was the XFX Speedster. I think it's meant to be Swift, SWFT. So
yep,
they're sticking to 4 letters for their product. So you got like the Swift, the Quick, and then the Merc. But it's the Swift 309. That's $480, and that looks like a pretty good card. So there is 2 models at the MSRP, at least at Newegg.com. So I guess that's better than none, but then they start to get up there. And XFX seems like the only brand, at least on the Newegg website, that's really competitive on pricing and close to the MSRP. So as I said, they've got the Swift at $480. Then for $20 more, which is only 4% over the MSRP, you get the Quick 319 Core. That looks very similar to the Merc. And then the Merc that I looked at's $570, which is 20% over the MSRP. So that's what I'd expect. $570 is your real premium products, which I guess it's very normal to see those products knocking on the door of the next product up, which in this case would be the RX 6800, because they're meant to be starting at $580 US. So that'll make sense. But then you've got like MSI, Gigabyte, Asus, and even PowerColor here, though PowerColor seems to be better in Australia. But the MSI Mech, that's like $750 US. Like, what was the RTX 3080 meant to cost? That's 56% over the MSRP. 56% over the MSRP. But then the MSI Gaming X, which was the model I received, which, to be perfectly honest, it's a perfectly acceptable graphics card, ran relatively cool, quite quiet, but it was nowhere near as good as like the Speedster Merc, for example. And that's $810 US. So that is 60% over almost 60% over the MSRP. So that's like 3 times the premium we'd expect. Pretty crazy. Yeah. And then, as I said, I didn't even bother looking at the Asus prices because they were ridiculous. We've got the PowerColor Hellhound, which is meant to be a base model. Again, $770 US. That's 60% over MSRP. Gigabyte Gaming OC, I'd expect that to be a more entry-level model, not your 20% premium, maybe 10 to 15%. That's, again, almost 60% over MSRP. $750 US. So it seems like a lot of the models, instead of being close to that $480 US, are more like $750 US, which I guess isn't going to shock too many of our viewers. But you'd like to see, because these are essentially MSRP prices for these brands. Like, Newegg isn't inflating the prices. This is the cheapest they can sell them for. Some people may look at that and go, Newegg is price scalping. They're charging, they're making an extra 40% or whatever, which I don't believe to be the case. I've seen the official MSRP pricing from AIBs, and this is the pricing that the AIBs have set. So
yeah, it's pretty crazy.
The AIBs appear to be cashing in on this one.
I guess the question for me is, like, with those XFX cards, are they going to raise to the same prices of those other models? Because you would expect that XFX is not going to be able to, it's not going to sit around and be like, oh, well, we only set a 20% margin. All the other brands have set a 60% margin. So, yeah, if that's just like a launch situation where they've sort of gone, oh, we want our pricing to look really competitive now and they're going to raise it later, then, yeah, that's not going to be as good of a situation. But you never really know. At least some people have potentially been able to buy the cards for that price, as well as the reference models. So I guess that is something better than nothing.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one because you'd only expect to see a bait and switch like that if, you had stock. Like, it would have made more sense to cash in now because they're going to sell them anyway and then go the other way.
Yeah, it's fair.
Not sure on that one, but raise a good point. I don't know why XFX is so good on pricing. Obviously, for most viewers, it doesn't really matter because they're all out of stock. But if we do start seeing healthy resupplies on a fairly regular basis, then your chances of buying one of these cards will be better. And XFX is obviously who you'd want to be looking out for because their pricing is very reasonable. And of course, you've also got the ASRock Challenger D in there as well, which looks like a reasonable card. We haven't tested it and probably won't, but at $480, you'd probably gamble just to save the 60% or whatever it is.
Yeah, the thing I find interesting is as well, like we've got obviously the Newegg market in the US where prices are inflated. It's kind of to be expected. That's the situation we're in right now, and that applies to a lot of GPUs. So it's not just like the 6700 XT sitting there with a 60% margin, as we know it, but basically everything has that margin. What I find interesting though is over here in Australia, when we look at a site like PC Case Gear, that the 6700 XT is, what I would say, substantially cheaper than the RTX 3070. Certainly not the $480 versus $500 US that they're supposed to be over there. They can be several $100s cheaper depending on the model. And this is excluding the reference card, which is cheaper again. If you sort of look at your base model versus base model 3070 versus 6700 XT, it can be quite substantially cheaper. And I think you've got some numbers there as well where it's like, 15-30% cheaper?
Yeah.
Depending on the card?
I would say that traditionally here in Australia, we do seem to get slapped with a fairly heavy NVIDIA tax.
I think that's
like
true.
An Apple tax, if you will. AMD GPUs in Australia do appear to be closer to sort of the prices you would see in the US, and then the NVIDIA side's inflated, and we're certainly seeing that here. So, I guess I'll start where you led me, which was they're meant to be 4% more at MSRP. So the RTX 3070s are meant to cost about 4% more than the RX 6700. But the reality in Australia is it's more like 30%. You could say 15% if you were a bit more favourable towards NVIDIA. Like the Sapphire Pulse and the Power Color Red Devil, they're pretty popular models, and they're $1,000 Australian. And then you've got I think the cheapest RTX 3070s, like an Inno 3D model at $1,150.
Which is such an insane price considering $500 should be like $700 or lower, right? Doing the conversion, tax, all that sort of thing.
Say $700 with shipping and tax and all that sort of stuff.
Which I think is where the reference models for the 6700 XT are priced in Australia. You could get them for $710, $750 Australian, which is that's the price. That's where this stuff should be. And then again, the AIBs are sort of putting all their taxes and margins on. But it does seem, at least for us, that the margins we're seeing on the 6700 XT are better than the 3070, which is something. I guess it may encourage a bit of competition. We'll have to do more research into what's the situation in Europe. We know we have a lot of European users and viewers, and I'm sure you guys will let us know in the comments what the situation is like in your market. But I guess it's a really bad situation, but when you look at what's been happening over the last 6 months, it's kind of one of the least bad situations that we've had recently. So I don't know. I don't really know where to sit on that point anymore. I guess it's just everything's so crazy these days that something so if this was just a normal launch and you're coming out and doing a 60% price inflation, you'd say they've lost their minds. But having somewhat reasonable stock, some cards available, the reference models available around the MSRP, a few AIB cards at MSRP, and then price inflation on the rest it's not too bad. So guess that's just currently what the situation is.
Yeah, the pricing's weird from region to region because, as we noted, the Power Color Hellhound is $770 US over at Newegg. That's 60% over the MSRP. Yet here in Australia, the exact same card's $900 Australian, which is only about 20% over the MSRP, which is probably more than you expect for a Hellhound model, which is more your entry-level card, but it's substantially better than the ratios we see over in the US. So
yeah, it's just weird.
Very weird, that one. And then for $100 more, you can land, as I said, the Sapphire Pulse, the Power Color Red Devil OC. They're about 33% over MSRP, which if they're in stock, that's for 2021, that's not bad. Like, I think
Yep.
normally we'd complain about that, but, we'll take it because, as I said, we're faced with like 60%, almost 70% in some instances. So 33%'s a bargain, as crazy as that sounds.
I guess it sort of brings me to the next point that I really wanted to discuss, and you touched a bit on this in your review, is let's put aside all the price craziness for a moment. I think one of the resounding things that has come across almost all reviews is that the actual MSRP for the 6700 XT is not particularly great. It's not... If cards were available and you could buy a 3070 at $500 and you had the 6700 XT at $480, most reviews, including yours, seem to suggest that the 3070 is the better buy there and that the 6700 XT is not particularly competitive at that price. So I just wanted to discuss this a little bit more with you about with a card like this, where does AMD realistically need to be pricing this to make it more attractive? Because even compared to the 5700 XT, it's nothing amazing there. Certainly massive stagnation in value. So I think you mentioned in your review $450. Is that sort of what you were suggesting?
Well, I'll go about this a few different ways. The first way I would say is, $450, because that puts it $50 under the MSRP of the RTX 3070, and that should make it slightly better in terms of cost per frame. So as it stands at $480 US, the 6700 XT is worse value, or it's more expensive than the RTX 3070 in terms of cost per frame. So that's not good. Like, you want to be saving money on the Radeon GPU, because whether you think ray tracing's garbage or not and you're not going to use it, it is, and we've said many times, ray tracing alone, it's not really, what would you say, a selling point of these models, but it is still a feature. Like, some people may be interested in the more mature ray tracing support with more titles to support it, it runs better. For me, ray tracing is like one of those, it's a thing, but more importantly, you've got DLSS. And again, a lot of people argue the merits of DLSS. Some people say it's garbage and it's, it makes the image blurry, or there's artifacts and it's not as good as reviewers make it out to be, or whatever the case may be. But I think that's probably being a bit too harsh. I'd say for the most part, DLSS is quite a handy feature, does offer a really nice performance boost, and I would say, without nitpicking, for the most part, the image quality is very good, very close to native. And again, as I came out of the closet and admitted in my review, I do play a bit of Fortnite. Again, for those who don't know, my daughter got me into it. She loves it, so I play it. It supports DLSS, and the performance uplift is insane. So I often play on my 4K editing system, and it can put me well up over 200 FPS, whereas without it, I'm down around 120. So, and that's with competitive quality settings so low. So that's a pretty big performance uplift there, and I honestly, when I'm playing the game, fairly fast-paced, I can't tell the difference. So, bit of a long-winded answer this one, but the point is DLSS is quite an interesting feature. Yeah, there's limited game support. You could argue either way, but it's another feature. You've got the NVIDIA encoder. So there's a few cool features there on NVIDIA's side that you don't get with AMD, and I think you and I are on the same page where we just think at this point in time, with that being the case, AMD can't price match NVIDIA. And they also have to offer a better value, better cost per frame, and they're not doing that right now. So I would say in a normal market where you can buy either of these cards at the MSRP, the 6700 XT would be, it might sound harsh, a bit of a flop, because it's just, it's not better value. It is worse value. It's worse value.
Yeah, I think so. It really seems like AMD is sort of, on the CPU side, we've seen Ryzen over the years increase in price, especially with the latest generation, as they become more and more competitive with Intel. So now that AMD's in a position where they do have the fastest processors for many different applications, they can come out and deliver premium pricing. And then in previous generations, they've generally been the more budget-oriented option, or had value products like Ryzen 5, 3600, etc. All that stuff that we've seen for a while. It really feels like with the Radeon products that AMD has kind of jumped the gun a little bit on going with the premium pricing. With the 5000 series, the 5700 XT, that was more sort of what we were expecting to see from AMD, where it's kind of like a Ryzen 5 3600 or Ryzen 5 2600 when you see a 5700 XT versus a 2070 or 2070 Super in in those times when those products were new. Whereas now they've sort of gone, oh, well, we're a premium graphics card producer now because we have the rasterization performance to match NVIDIA's products. And I guess that's a fair angle to take for them, but they're trying to sell it on that angle while ignoring all the other stuff and sort of saying, oh, well, we can price it based on this one thing, but then if anyone's interested in all the other stuff, in the DLSS, in the ray tracing, in encoding, in all those areas, then the value proposition isn't there, and it does make it seem quite expensive or too expensive for those tiers. We've done polls in the past, for example, that show people saying it really should be in the sort of 10-20% range cheaper at the same price tier. And the problem that AMD's had is that they've priced it so close, like 6700 XT versus 3070, that we start talking about all this stuff. We start talking about ray tracing and DLSS to sort of separate the cards. So they've kind of made their own bed there with that situation of pricing it too close, where people are forced to talk about the differentiating features, and when they can't compete on those things, then it becomes a more negative situation for AMD. So I think even $450 could be a little bit too expensive even then. That's for this sort of card.
For sure.
I feel like people buying a premium GPU would be willing to spend sort of your 10% more to go from a $450 GPU to a 3070 at $500. And I don't necessarily think it needs to be priced like 3060 tier at $400, but something like $420 I think would have made it a really compelling product. Again, this is all sort of your theoretical stuff because cards aren't available, but
ultimately doesn't matter.
Ultimately doesn't matter, but I think the general sentiment among a lot of reviewers, when you even can't talk about is this card going to be available, is that, well, I don't know, even if it was, it's only okay. So I don't think for AMD in its market share position that having an only okay product is the best course for them. But maybe I'm sure there's a whole bunch of factors. It wouldn't make any sense to price this card at $420 right now when AMD could make an additional $60 on every single GPU they sell. So yeah, it's just kind of the situation we're in.
Yeah, the price makes complete sense and it's not unexpected. But during more normal times, which was what this discussion was really about, you can't have a product that is actually worse value and missing some of those features. Whether or not you want those features, well, that's up to you to decide. But you're starting off at its worst value. So it's like, how do you get from its worst value to its as good value or its better value? You can't really. What's the argument? Like, it's got 4 gigabytes more of VRAM, which is not nothing and should be... I'm not saying we should ignore that. You've got more and more games now coming up with DLSS. Do you play these games that support DLSS? That can give you a performance bump now. And that's guaranteed now, not maybe in 2 years' time. So you've got to weigh up those things as well. And, you know, the example you gave with Ryzen 5000 is a perfect example, because compared to what Intel has with the 10th gen, you've got a better range of motherboards, more affordable motherboards, arguably faster CPUs, or at least as fast, that are much more efficient. You know, the list goes on of all the advantages there, so they can command that price premium. But for Radeon GPUs, they've jumped the gun. They're not there yet.
Yeah, I think the VRAM argument is probably... I mean, we've said in the past that the 3070 is probably $400 or $500 GPU, especially for 4K gaming, which is you're kind of approaching 4K gaming on that sort of card these days. 8 gigabytes is probably on the edge, and ideally you would want more VRAM in that product. So for me, obviously having 12 gigabytes on a 6700 XT it's better. Like, there's no doubt having more VRAM is better, but does that outweigh the other things, especially when the pricing is so close? And it's probably a no on that. Whereas I'm interested to get your thoughts on this as well, is what about the driver overhead situation that we've seen recently? Do you think that is worth considering with this sort of product in this price tier?
It's worth considering at any price tier. For me, that's not the main consideration. It's really, what do you have in your system right now? What games do you play? And if it's going to be a problem, when would you likely upgrade your CPU? So if you're sitting with like a Ryzen 7 3700X right now, I don't think it's really something that you should be concerned about. You should have enough CPU overhead there where it's just not going to be a problem. So with a 3700X, plenty of headroom there. I don't think you got to run into really any situations at the moment with the current games we have where you're going to hit sort of up around 80% utilization, because that's when this becomes a problem. When your CPU, overall the CPU, so across all the cores and threads, you're hitting a total of about 80% utilization. When you start getting to there, that's when the Radeon GPUs can offer more performance, and you start getting bottlenecked on the CPU front by your GeForce GPU. So yeah, applying that to just this comparison's hard. It's always a consideration. So if you have, a Ryzen 5, maybe 2600, or in particular a 1600, or an older Core i5 processor, then yeah, maybe buying the Radeon GPU would be a smarter move, especially if you play games like Warzone, any of the games we've seen that use a lot of the CPU, like sort of your Battlefield multiplayer type games. I'll probably do a separate video that delves into that a bit more, that looks at the CPU configurations, but I think, as we said in our last discussion, we should probably keep that out of the reviews.
Yeah.
Because while it's a factor to consider, it's a bit too confusing and people don't really know when it applies. So it really comes down to, that's something you should just keep in mind. If the games you're currently playing, you're seeing your CPU already heavily utilized. And if you're using a GeForce GPU on that situation, actually upgrading to a Radeon GPU could hold off your CPU upgrade for another generation. So again, that's something I might look into in a future video, or I really do plan to look into that. But it's a whole complicated thing that I probably don't want to get into this one, because it's just difficult to explain properly and sort of account for all the variables there.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion though, because I feel like when you look at what AMD's providing on the features side, they don't really have too much that you could sort of point to and be like, this is a clear features advantage. This isn't, and to be fair, this isn't really a feature of an AMD part, because it's not like a setting you turn on in a game or a cool proprietary tool or something. It's kind of just the way the cards are made. Yeah. So
it's supported by at the hardware level.
Yes, though. Yeah. So I guess it is in some ways a feature, not really like a DLSS or something like that. But I really do feel, and I agree with a lot of what you said on the 6700 XT side, where it's kind of they're fighting an uphill battle, pricing it where they have, and with the feature set that they have, that they needed to, say, either beat it on rasterization performance or something along those lines, so that you could say, oh, well, not only is it faster than a 3070, it's a little bit cheaper, and it has more VRAM. And then the 3070, the arguments for that would be things like your ray tracing and DLSS and that, which would have made it a much more compelling argument one way or another. And I guess moving into the next thing that I wanted to talk about.
Sorry, before you do that, to cap this one off, I think to summarize it best would be, I think our viewers would prefer that the 6700 XT was cheaper rather than have another 4 gigabytes of VRAM.
Yes,
so think of that product, if it was like, do you want 4 gigabytes more to have double the VRAM, or do you want to just make it closer to the 5700 XT in terms of pricing? I think people would rather the discount, because they're not going to be able to use the extra VRAM probably for that sort of mid-range product. Anyway, that's I think that's how I'd end that one.
Yeah, so I think the things we want to sort of talk about to wrap up this video is sort of the other things that AMD can do to compete, and where we sort of see AMD's Radeon division heading a little bit in the future. Because one thing that's come out this week has been more discussion around the lack of a DLSS competitor on AMD's side, and what is happening with Fidelity Effects Super Resolution, which is supposed to be AMD's competing feature. And I can't remember the publication off the top of my head that did an interview with a member of AMD's staff.
PC World, I think.
But one of the key takeaways from this interview was that while AMD is working on FSR, or Fidelity FX Super Resolution, that it doesn't really sound super close to being finished. At least they're sort of targeting coming out in 2021, which usually when they target an entire year as a date for when something is going to come out, they mean right at the end of the year or around that mark. And then on top of that, there was a couple of concerning things in there from my perspective, things such as AMD talking about, well, we might not do this via machine learning or AI. We have a few different options in mind that we're sort of considering, a couple of different options of how to do this that we're considering. And I would say if you're anywhere close to finishing this sort of feature, you probably would have settled on a way to do it by now. Like you'd have a fairly good idea of the best way to achieve a DLSS-like feature, which makes it seem like they're still quite firmly in the development stage of this feature. Which
it's I was gonna say, it sounds like the sort of the draft board. They're trying to work out how to actually do this.
Yeah, which
they're saying it'll be out this year. Which this
not good.
Yeah, Scott Herkelman was the one that said this. Not having a go at Scott, but he has put his foot in it recently when it comes to supply. I don't know. We'll see. Sorry, go on.
It really doesn't give you a lot of confidence. Like, you kind of wonder why AMD's been talking about this feature for as long as they have, when it doesn't really seem like... Are they just trying to get people involved in sort of, oh, don't worry about DLSS, our thing is coming. Shh, don't tell anyone, it's actually ages away still. It kind of feels like that's the situation, and it doesn't give me a lot of faith in what the technology is. I mean, it could end up being a good technology, but if it comes out at the end of this year, it really is very late and too late to consider for this generation. Because you'll have like a 3070 and 3080 in people's hands for like a year at that point. You know, an entire new generation. DLSS titles are getting more supported, and if Fidelity FX Super Resolution as well requires game implementation, not like a universal feature across games, they're starting years behind the 8-ball on a feature that is really necessary for today's games in terms of competing for GPU features. So, yeah, I was not super impressed with that interview in terms of talking about that feature, and it really doesn't seem like something that should be considered for this generation, but just based on that. But again, it's hard to say what's going to happen, because 2021 timeframe, it could mean, hey, we've got it ready in June, and that would be great. But yeah, it still seems far too early for that, which is a bit of a concern.
Yeah, 100% agree with everything you've said. It seems like they just want to sort of put their hand up and say, yeah, we do have a DLSS competitor incoming, let's say this year, and hope that one doesn't backfire on us. But hey, we've given it a name. We've got a name, guys. So
name's the first start, right?
yeah, stuff's happening on our end. That's what it sort of seems like. And yeah, when I sort of went over that interview as well, came away with the same sort of stuff as well. Not very confident, and it seems like they are still in the very early stages of this, and by choice they wouldn't be talking about it, but they've kind of put their foot in it already by saying they do have a DLSS competitor coming. So they've kind of had to talk about it, but it seems like they've got, again, beyond dialing in the name, not a whole lot. But maybe there's more. Maybe Scott undersold it in the interview. Not sure on that one.
Yeah, I mean,
we'll have to wait and see.
I think, as we've talked about on the channel a couple of times previously, there is going to be a future at some point where this sort of technology is the way that games are played. Similar to, MSAA gets replaced by like your TAA in most games, so your temporal anti-aliasing as opposed to multi-sample. Eventually, things move in that direction, and at one point, brands tend to be better at one thing than the other. We've talked about all this stuff in the past, NVIDIA being better at tessellation to begin with, and then over time, both brands tend to do what they do quite well. And I would expect the same thing here, but it really is going to hurt AMD's GPU division in the short term before we get to that point where it's kind of just a ubiquitous feature that everyone uses. And I think if you've watched our channel for a while, our opinions of DLSS are sort of getting more and more positive over time. It's becoming more of a significant feature. More games included. Unreal Engine 4 tools, very popular game engine. DLSS is supported in there. It's going to be a struggle for them. And if they're set on sort of this pricing structure of, we want to make our GPUs premium and priced at the same mark as NVIDIA's, it's going to be a struggle for them, which I guess is unfortunate position to be in for them. But hopefully in a couple of years, it's all sorted out. The final thing, IPC video. This was interesting. I think it's been at the point that we're recording this, it hasn't been published on the channel just yet, but when this video goes live, you probably will have all have seen this. Were you surprised by the results of testing the 6700 XT versus 5700 XT at the same clock speeds? Not really, because it's clocked at least 35% higher and it was 30% faster. And that's kind of the clock scaling, like performance scaling you'd expect to see from that. So it kind of made sense. If you drop them down to the same clock speed, the performance will be
pretty much the same. I thought we might see, again, I didn't test a huge amount of games. I think it was 8 or so games I tested, and at what point do you want to keep testing where you're not seeing the exact same results?
Yep.
I think normally I would have probably thrown a bit more time into it, but I want to look at this driver overhead stuff some more, do a lot more interesting combos there. But yeah, I was expecting to see pretty much what we did see, but I thought there may be a few instances where there was 5 to 10%, and I guess we did see that a little bit, but not as much as maybe I was expecting to see. So it just seems to be down to clock speed, which isn't a problem. I mean, the fact that they were able to improve clock speeds without changing the process by so much is pretty impressive. Like, it's a huge architectural upgrade, what they've achieved there. It'd be better if it was at the same price, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a lot of the architectural design considerations that they made weren't necessarily about improving IPC, but improving the efficiency substantially on that product, which was the real takeaway that I had from watching the video. Is like, yeah, okay, so IPC isn't improved, but they're clocking it substantially higher on the same process node. That is quite an achievement. And obviously RDNA itself was kind of a big step forward in terms of their architecture versus previous generations. So again, it's kind of been a two-step process. Get the IPC gains in last gen, do the efficiency gains this generation, and now they've got their price to performance ratio in a very competitive point compared to NVIDIA. The thing I sort of wonder about for the future is they're already clocking these GPUs pretty high, like 2.5 gigahertz. You can get your overclocks up to like 2.7 gigahertz, which is insane for a GPU, which makes you wonder, like, well, in the future they can't just, it's unlikely on a new process node, for example, that they'll be able to push that up to like 3 gigahertz, 3.5 gigahertz on a GPU, which means they're really going to have to get in and do some IPC improvements for the next generation, which will be interesting to see what they can achieve out of that. Obviously, they can add more compute units. That's another way they can go to improve performance. But yeah, I'm really interested to see where they go from there now that they've sort of fixed all the different parts with this RDNA 2 architecture and have it in a really good position.
I think where the next big step will take place is when we see chiplets.
Yeah.
So that's going to be huge for graphics like it was for CPUs. And yeah, I think we'll see that in the not too distant future. I'm pretty excited for it, but obviously we don't have anything concrete at the moment. But I imagine as I said, it's going to be a similar thing to what we saw with Ryzen. But they may hit the ground running a bit harder than they did with Ryzen. So
probably have learned some lessons from doing chiplet designs in those things and the advantages that they can get. But yeah, certainly scaling up beyond, say, your 80 compute units for a 6800, 6900 XT product. It's going to sort of be the future there. And even then, AMD is already making smaller dies than NVIDIA for the same sort of level of rasterization performance. Obviously, NVIDIA's got tensor cores, ray tracing, dedicated ray tracing hardware, all that stuff that makes their dies larger. So it'll be interesting to see whether they go with, like, could they do 160 compute units on a dual die solution? That would be pretty insane if they were able to achieve something like that. Obviously, memory is going to be a concern. But yeah, so I think the future there is quite exciting in terms of where things could go. But again, that's all sort of speculation for the future type stuff. So,
well, I'm sure Infinity Cache was paving the way to help address that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Quite an interesting design decision they made there with the Infinity Cache. We'll have to see whether NVIDIA does something similar there with future design. Who knows? Like, I think they've got some driver overhead stuff and hardware schedulers to include in the meantime as well on their design, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much they care about that stuff, to be honest with you.
It's a good point.
Realistically, that kind of stuff only impacts budget buyers, secondhand, shoppers, that kind of stuff. The guys who are buying high-end GPUs with the latest CPUs, it's a non-issue. As was the case back in the DirectX 11 days, you've got heaps of CPU overhead, so you might as well spend that doing that scheduler work there and make the GPU faster. I don't think they're going to change that anytime soon, but yeah, I could be wrong.
Yeah, who knows?
We'll have to see.
Is there anything else you want to talk about in regards to 6700 XT and all that stuff that's been happening?
I don't think so, not off the top of my head. I think we had a pretty long discussion at this point. We've been going for, I think, over 40 minutes. So
Yep.
that's probably long enough. We don't have to make all of these an hour. I thought we might even be able to try to cram this one in a half an hour, but whatever. Like, as I said at the start, it's just a casual conversation. We make a couple of notes here and there and just see where it takes us. And yeah, I think it's kind of good follow-up content to the more scripted benchmark stuff that we normally do. So yeah,
so I think that's probably come to the close on this video. It's been good to get on board and do another discussion type video. Always enjoy doing these. And yeah, if you're interested in supporting the channel, you want to support our testing, all that sort of stuff, we have our Patreon and Floatplane accounts. We'll put the links to those in the description below. You can sign up, you can chat to us in our Discord community, which is always great. We do get a lot of feedback on our videos from there, which does inform these sort of discussion pieces, what people want to see us talk about. Obviously, YouTube comments as well helps out there as well. Behind the scenes videos, your studio is still being built, so you get to see some BTS videos over time as that gets finished and you start moving into the new area. And live streams, all that sort of stuff. It's going to be a bit of fun. So that's pretty much it for this one. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you guys for watching. I'm Monitor Steve.
I'm in-person Tim, I guess. We should swap this around one time, or do like 2 monitors or something like that, and I can be a monitor Tim for once. That'd be interesting.
Could do. Who knows? There's plenty of exciting things on the horizon, Tim.
Oh wow. Two monitors in a video is the peak of exciting content we've got coming up on the channel.
You can't buy a GPU now, so that'll have to do.
Well,
all right.
anyway,
thanks for watching.
We'll see you in the next one.
time.